Hey, Cookie, welcome, mate.
G'day, Mark. How you going this month?
Pretty good.
Yeah,
well,
good.
it's an interesting month. I mean, there's a lot of stuff happening outside the
Yep.
tightening, neutral, easing environment. Outside of that, I mean, other things around the RBA, et cetera, that I'm finding quite fascinating. Only, a few days ago, did our new Reserve Bank governor-elect,
Yep.
elected by the Labor Party, not elected by you or me, although we may have appointed her, but I didn't really see who all the candidates were. But and I'm not going to say Sandra Bullock because I keep saying Sandra Bullock, but
Michelle.
Bullock,
Yes.
Sandra's sister. But anyway, she had a very interesting reception recently where she made a speech and she was harangued by a pretty rowdy crowd. Off the back of them saying, "Well, are you going to create a situation?" Because she keeps talking about it, 4.5% being the new unemployment number. Are you going to create 140,000 unemployed people? Which is a fair comment. I mean, I don't like the way they did it, but it's a fair comment because one of the things that the RBA has always positioned itself as is neutral in that they don't go political. They say these are the numbers we're trying to achieve, and 4.5% is the right modelling number for us to indicate to us that there's not going to be any pressure on wages, so much so that those wages will no longer at that number create inflation. So therefore, 4.5% is the number. They don't ordinarily go into the territory saying, and we feel sorry for those people who are going to lose a job because it's not their territory, it's not their thing. It's not what they're supposed to do. They're not political.
That's why the unemployment rate safety net's there for the people who do become unemployed.
Correct.
In any business cycle.
That's more for the government.
Correct. It is indeed.
To attend
Indeed.
to.
100%.
And but it's a fair comment because maybe the RBA should start thinking about those things. Who knows? But also in her conversation, in her speech, she talked about, I don't know if the words are climate change, but the effects of climate change potentially on inflation, therefore on interest rates. What's your read on that?
The climate change issue is happening. We know that, and it will impact on the economy, insurance premiums, where people want to live. Weather events, storm events, insurance is going to be the one area where it's going to be most important. Now, on a month-to-month basis, even a year-to-year basis, the impact will be too small, I think, to measure. Now, occasionally you saw in the floods in Lismore a little while ago, the bushfires a couple of years ago, there are implications for an economy when a natural disaster or a climate change disaster, if we can call it that, does happen. It does impact on the economy. It changes the inflation rate. Even a cyclone. Remember 10 years ago, banana prices went up because of a cyclone in Queensland.
And lettuces in Victoria.
And lettuces, yes, all that sort of stuff. Lettuces went to $10.
And cherries.
Yep.
Bad cherry
all that stuff does impact inflation and prices and the economy. And if we've got to rebuild new houses that burn down or get washed away in the flood, unfortunately, tragedy that is, it does impact on the economy. However, they're the sort of events that to me don't materially change that big picture view where the RBA, and under the new charter that Michelle Bullock has agreed to when she confirmed her appointment, is to keep inflation between 2 to 3% over the cycle. And we know, if it's 2.9 or 2.8, 3.0, that's great, that's fine. So I don't think those things are going to be impacting the inflation rate that's going to say, oh, gee, because of global warming or we've got El Nino and there's a drought coming, we're going to hike rates or cut rates. I don't think it's that sort of thing. Maybe over, 5 or 10 years. It depends what happens to the climate. I'm no climate scientist. I do look at this stuff and, I think we're warming. I think we are. But how that impacts on the economy is still really unclear. So I think, it's a bit like saying they're going to take out of El Nino or La Nina, these big weather events or too much rain or not enough rain. And there's droughts and that has impacts on the supply of cattle. Sometimes if there's a drought, the meat prices fall because the farmers send the cows off to be slaughtered because they're going to die in the drought. When they've got to restock, prices go up because they're keeping all their cattle for rebreeding. They don't hike and cut interest rates on the back of that.
You're right. Historically, you don't. Just like I said, historically, the RBA never considers people who are losing their jobs as a result of increasing interest rates to attack inflation, trying to push unemployment number up. I mean, they might feel it personally, but might think about it at a personal level. But as an institution, it's not something they should consider. Ordinarily, it's not in their mandate. But, we live in different times. And politics seems to creep into everything. And morality and ethics is starting to creep into every policy decision making effort these days, it seems to me. Could it be that the RBA is going to join the process of trying to control climate?
I don't think there's anything wrong with talking about a whole range of policies. And even just in this last week, the issue of the GST's come up in tax reform, this intergenerational report, we're all living longer, getting older.
Can we deal with that for a second?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Steve, that intergenerational report, I can't believe they're talking about 40 years from now.
They can't get 4 weeks right, let alone 40 years.
The RBA government, go back 2 years.
And we rates on hold till 2024, and we've had 400 points.
Why are we even thinking about it? It's the craziest, most. And you know as well as you can't make any assumptions. This is modelling at its worst. Okay, this is absolute worst, modelling at its worst, because the major. Well, the concept of modelling is by definition is always wrong, because you can never include every single variable into the model. Modelling is not about anything; it's about the variables, the assumptions you make.
And human behaviour is one thing you can't model.
You can't.
You can sort of say normally when we put interest up, house prices fall. But what about immigration? What about the cost of building? What about the supply of new
public
construction?
policy?
Correct. So if there was nothing else that changed, interest rates went up, house prices would go down. But there are a myriad of other things that influence house prices. As we're seeing right now, we've had 400 basis points of rate hikes, and house prices since February this year are up about 6%, I think it is. So, but the reason why I mentioned that sort of more medium-term thing about what the RBA might do on climate change is to and maybe they know more than I do on how it's going to be impacting if Australia or the world gets hotter and drier and more volatile weather. If that's what's going to be happening, they may say that they're going, and I think Phil Lowe touched on this when he mentioned it in passing. He didn't have a serious or a long-term speech on it. He sort of said that, we will get more volatile inflation. When lettuces go to $10, when bananas go to $15 a kilo, when houses get burned or washed away, we've got a shortage of tradies to build them and materials to build them. They said so they're going to get more volatile inflation. So instead of sort of for the last 30 years until recently, inflation sort of was generally 1.5 to 3.5. Occasionally went above, occasionally went down, but basically was in the 2 to 3 target for 25 odd years. The inference is that, when lettuces go to $10, inflation will go to 5%. When they grow again, it'll drop to 0%. And so I think the way that they're going to be telling us and the community to interpret the inflation numbers is to look around issues that are caused probably by climate change. I think it's more that sort of stuff. So whether that means they get a new underlying inflation measure and strip out, the price of things influenced by rain, which is sort of why the trimmed mean measure is actually pretty good.
Yeah.
So, to talk about lettuces again and bananas, that was sure, it impacted inflation. Yep, we're all paying $10 for lettuce and $15 for a kilo of bananas. But the trimmed mean inflation rate took those things out. They trimmed them out of the inflation. So you had core inflation, like what's happening to the price of the things that are there every day in our consumption. And they're not influenced by the whims of the weather.
So why the hell did she raise it? Look, I'm a bit more, maybe a little bit more suspicious than you. But a new governor, nearly a maiden speech, nearly.
Effectively, yes.
Talks about that. I mean, and it's the first time I've ever actually heard it as the subject matter of a speech. I just get very nervous about this sort of stuff.
I can't work out how it would actually figure into their month to month, or they're soon going to be meeting 8 times a year, so every 6 weeks when the new system comes into place next year. So every 6 weeks when they meet, I don't think and can't see how it's going to materially change. Do we need to hike? Do we need to cut? Do we need to leave them steady? The fact that we might have a climate event impacting the economy because the supply and demand sort of issues, the things that drive inflation, the things that get us to that 2 to 3 inflation target, when we've got the equilibrium between supply and demand, right? Inflation increases by 2.5%.
In a normalised market, yeah.
Yeah, when there's no COVID, pandemics and, all these other things going on. I still think they're going to just adjust interest rates or leave them unchanged according to that target.
Then why the hell did you raise it?
I can't answer that.
I just can't understand it. Like
Yeah.
I was flabbergasted when I read it. I didn't listen to it. I actually read the text, but
Yes.
I was actually flabbergasted. And I guess what will happen here, Cookie, is that we'll get a better understanding of where they're going to, because as you remember, the review recommended two boards. One board
Yes.
for business as usual, day to day stuff, and the other board will be opining every whatever it is 8 times a year on interest rates.
Correct.
So we
So a
don't.
monetary policy board,
Yeah,
as
correct.
opposed to one that looks after printing banknotes
Yeah,
and admin of the
correct.
staff and all
But we
that
don't know
stuff.
who's on that new board.
No, it hasn't been appointed
And,
yet.
for
No.
me, Bill Evans, please put your hand up if you're not. I mean, I'm being cynical, but Bill, I know you're retiring, and I'm hoping the reason for that is you've been tapped on the shoulder to join that board, because he's a great. For me, he's a very neutral guy, but he
Yes.
also understands this stuff, interest rates. That is.
Oh, people like that. I'm hoping the new board is dominated, if that's the right word, with people with financial markets experience. I've had this sort of exchange of views with other people about they need more academics and things like that. Look, the Reserve Bank, to get a job in the Reserve Bank, you've got to be a PhD, you've got to have a economics IQ of God knows what. The RBA is full of academic economists. They're brilliant. What you need, and what the problem was in the last 4 or 5 years, was that academic modelling, as we were chatting about before, that modelling led them up the garden path. They made errors. They need a few practical people who have worked in financial markets, who talk to global investors, who talk to people and understand that, hang on, this is, when inflation started going up, and even after it went up, Dr. Lowe said, no rate hikes till 2024, people in the markets were saying, what the hell is that?
Why would you even say
So
it?
if you had a board that had a Bill Evans, and yes, vote one Bill, although we don't vote on that. But if you had Bill Evans and a couple of his calibre on this monetary policy board, I dare say we would have had a much better response to this lift in inflation. They would have hiked earlier, which would have nipped it in the bud a little better. Sure, we still had an inflation problem. There was a whole lot of things going on, but it would have nipped it in the bud a little earlier, probably made the peak a little bit lower.
But they definitely would have predicted 2024 either. They wouldn't have said.
Oh, heavens no! And I read Bill's stuff all the time, and I think I don't want to misquote him, but I recall in late 21, early 22, when this no hikes till 2024 issue was being discussed by the RBA, he was throwing cold water on that well and truly. Yep.
So we will see what the colours of the RBA will be in the future. I think we'll be able to tell by who they actually appoint to this monetary policy board, the new one in the RBA, which must have to be decided pretty soon, because
I think so too. I haven't seen a timetable, but here we are. Well, it's basically September.
Yep.
They'd want to get the people on board and get them familiar and get them ready to gear up for their new really important responsibility.
I find this whole area, the review, the RBA board review, the appointment of who's now appointed, Ms. Bullock, the new constitution, what we will soon be told. I find the whole thing fascinating. I find Bullock's conversation the other night quite fascinating about climate change and how that sort of sits within the remit of the RBA board in terms of considerations. I find it fascinating. I think politics in my world, that I see it, the way I see it, has a way of having its own process of osmosis. And it seems to bleed into just about every part of our lives now. I mean, including, we got the yes/no vote going on at the moment. It's coming out of all sorts of places, all sorts of people talking about it for when they got nothing to do with yes/no. Everyone seems to have an opinion on everything that's political.
Yep.
And I get nervous about that, because I like hard-lined economic decisions when it comes to interest rates. That's me.
When it comes to the economy, as we've learned, and in fact, this is sort of more of a big picture view. From the late 80s, early 90s, we've had generally really good economic policy management. And I put that down, and I'm happy to admit this. Hawke, Keating, Costello, and Howard, but Costello was sort of more economics than Howard, whatever. Well, they got a couple of things wrong. Nobody's perfect. And when you're in government for 5 years, 10 years, you'll get a couple of things wrong. But I think some of Australia's success owes a lot to those people who took the tough economic decisions. Sure, there was a bit of politics involved. Sure, there was. But the things that they implemented, superannuation, floating the dollar, the GST, cutting income taxes, adjusting company tax scales, opening up the Australian banking system. There's a myriad of things that did. Australia is better for that.
For the tough decisions.
For the tough decisions. And so you need, and same with interest rates. Back in the early 90s, the RBA became independent. It was formalised by Costello in 96, if I remember correctly. And so the independent RBA, 2 to 3 target, hike and cut without fear or favour. Without fear or favour, even during election campaign. If we've got to hike rates, we've got to hike rates.
Which they did too.
Which they did. They've done twice.
Yep.
So that was good, and it served Australia well.
Hard-nosed, non-political decisions.
And look at the
data.
Facts.
Yeah.
Look at the data, the facts, and the consequences of what you're about to do.
Yeah, so in other words, abide by the mandate.
Yeah, it sounds really simple if you say it quickly like that. Yeah.
So we will soon see.
We'll soon see, yes. By the way, they've also got to appoint a new deputy governor because that's appointed by the government.
Maybe Guy Debelle wants to come back now that he's left Fortescue.
Who knows? Who knows? I can't comment on that either. I don't know.
Well, it's going to be really interesting because I can't wait for that. So let's talk about tightening, neutral, easing. What's the story, mate? What's not floating around at the moment, sort of tending to me to indicate in terms of data and releases, seems to indicate to me stay where we are, stay the same. Not put them up, don't put them down, just not say too much, just wait and see how it all rolls out. But is there anything out there that we should be looking at?
The big news in the last month since our last recording were wages data and the labour market data. We had a few other bits and bobs too, but they were the big issues. Wages data, the wage price index, came in at 3.6% annual, down from 3.7. It actually, it's only 0.1 difference, but the market and the RBA were looking for it to go towards 4%. So that was critically important because the RBA feared, and you mentioned it before, were, maybe still are, worried that the low unemployment rate would feed into higher wages, would feed into higher inflation. That is not underlined, not happening. The wages data were actually, while they weren't weak, they did dispel that theory.
Wages are not rising.
Yeah, they're steady at an okay level that's acceptable. There is an acceptable level. If everyone got a 20% wage rise, the economy is stuffed. If everyone gets 0, it's not good either. 3.5-ish, 4% is about right, and it's consistent, most importantly, with the 2 to 3 inflation target. So wages, a little softer than expected. So don't hike rates again. The other thing that happened, which reinforces on hold, is the unemployment numbers which came out a couple of weeks ago. First of all, you had a minus 14,000 in employment. Like 14,000 people lost their jobs last month. The unemployment rate went from 3.5% to 3.7%. So, the monthly numbers are all volatile. Yep, they just do a survey of the population.
But still, they're the monthly numbers.
But they went up.
Yeah.
Oh, so unemployment went up,
yeah.
Employment went down. So if the board meeting's sitting there and they think, unemployment's up, wages, a bit weaker than we thought, then you add in things like retail sales. You look at the global economy, the US is probably doing better than we thought. China's probably doing worse than we thought. So the global economy is still, soft, probably not a recession, but certainly a long way from a boom. So everything's pointing to on hold. Yep.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I mean, we saw the government have given themselves not the public servants, or maybe it is public servants, but definitely the politicians have given themselves a 4% wage rise.
Public servants too, by the way.
Public servants as well.
Yep.
So that the public service account for probably maybe 15% of the total and total employed in Australia.
About that,
yeah.
Yes. For what do we call it? The departmental public service. If you add police, nurses, teachers, there's another 5 or 6% of the workforce.
So it's close to 20%.
All up.
That's state and fed. So
correct.
The feds who just gave themselves a 4%
correct.
rise, but you would expect that to sort of somehow seep into the state at a state level. But
yep.
It's not a bad benchmark. But that's a little bit above. For me, that's a little bit uncomfortable.
A smidge above. My caveat would be, to cut them some slack, they got really weak wage increases due to the pandemic. if I remember correctly, some of them only got 1.5. So if you actually look at, say, a 3-year moving average, it's probably with a 4, it's probably around about 3 and a bit percent.
But still, it
So
is
it's a bit of a
4%.
catch up. But it's 4% today, though.
Yeah,
That's the things that matters.
So the question becomes,
Yep.
is that enough to be inflationary, do you think?
That's you don't want any more than that.
Right.
That's your, and in all seriousness, that's the upper bound on wage. Look, if we got 4.1, that's fine. But as soon as you get to say 4.25, 4.5%, you then start ringing the alarm bell. That is the sort of wage increase that if it's sustained if it's just a one-off and it comes back down, fine. If it's 4.5, oh, you've got an inflation problem. That's what the RBA is worried about. So that's what I was talking about a minute ago. The official wages number for the June quarter, 3.6%, spot on. The 4% wage increase for, well, public servants and some other awards, or even the minimum wage case, that was 5.75%. Now, not many people get the minimum wage, but for those who do, that was 5.75%. That's just bumped up. So wages, look, I'm not worried about wages because the economy's slowing down and immigration's high, and a lot of those immigrants work. They take a job. But it is still something that's just on the side of your radar.
Yeah, I'm just a little bit concerned about it relative to interest rates. As you said correctly, it was the June number, but we're in September now. So, and we're seeing 15 to 20% of them, well, 15% at least is now going to have a 4% wage rise. So, which if I add that 15%. And I don't know what it is in terms of total dollars because that's 50% of individuals as opposed to 15% of, it's not 15% of the total wage. And I don't know what the total wage is, but of the public service. I definitely don't know that one. But in terms of numbers, it's still statistically significant, as you would expect. So we might see a different number that we might get in October for the September quarter, or
yes, that will
from
be
3 points.
We may, yes,
we may or may not.
But the interesting thing for the 3.6 for the annual run rate, last September quarter we had a 1.2 for the quarter, because remember when Labor won the election in early 2022, there was that minimum wage increase. Yep. So we've actually got a high number in the run rate. So for the 3.6 to go up, you've got to get a quarterly result above 1.2. And you've got to remember that the way that the ABS calculate a 4% wage increase is 1% per quarter.
Right.
They don't do 4%. Yeah. So they do a, what do you call it, extrapolation to, yeah. And then if it's 3.5, 3.5 divided by 4, they put that through the quarterly profile.
Yep. Okay.
So yes, we will get a higher than quarterly result, but the annual figure might just be bouncing around roughly where it is.
Okay, mathematically, probably, or statistically, in terms of significance anyway, probably nothing really to worry about. Is there anything else on the horizon? So is there any wage cases or claims or et cetera flying around out there?
They're continuing, but they're actually not so bad. In fact, if we look at the other thing that we haven't discussed, and that's fine, because a few weeks ago now, is that in early August, the Reserve Bank put out their quarterly statement on monetary policy. That was just after we did our last recording. In that, they do a survey of firms, of businesses. They ask people like Seek and Indeed, the labour hire websites, what is the wage level that you're advertising? So the average job that you're advertising, what's the annual wage? And they work out a percent change. And that was actually also showing that wages were topping out. They weren't falling, but the rate of growth was topping out. They're all slightly different measures. The award increases aren't that high. There's a lot of businesses that aren't getting that much. They might be getting 3%, but those people who are getting 5% are few and far between, if you know what I mean. So there's a whole lot of things, and I think that immigration is actually, I won't say flooding the labour market, but it's providing a fair bit of labour supply to the industries that were short of labour, and that ranges from forklift truck drivers to people, on building sites,
admin
on
people,
and admin, all that, let alone IT, tech, gurus, all that sort of stuff. So you're actually seeing a bit of a inflow of supply of labour, and that's just taking the heat out of that wage increase.
Can I ask you one more thing? Very topical, it's sort of politically topical, definitely if you're reading the AFR. Airfares. Now,
Oh, yes.
no, well, it's,
Yeah.
because
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh,
services is one of the big things that's out of control in terms of our inflation
it's where the
number.
inflation
Yeah, so
pulse is. Yes,
so if
yes,
you look at
definitely.
the basket of goods and
Yep,
services,
yep.
goods are pretty much under control.
Yes,
Services, the thing is out of control. That includes rents, for example, and
correct.
we're always talking about rents. We're just undersupplied, so we're gonna have a rent problem. Don't worry about it. It's just going to keep going. So
Yep.
it's going to continue to influence the inflation number for a while. And I don't really see any outcome. I don't see how they're going to solve that for the moment. To be frank with you,
Not in the short term. No,
completely
no.
honest.
Yep,
We're not going to get a surge in new housing all of a sudden.
It
next
takes a
month.
year or two to build a house.
There's a lead time.
To turn from a bit of dirt into a house that someone can move, it takes at least a year.
So let's
Anyway.
look at the other services that I've just touched
Yep.
on, the political area. And no one's talking about it, but they keep saying, "Oh, well, it's it's unfair for Virgin or it's unfair for consumers." But it's unfair for all of Australians because those airline prices and also the cost of other services like restaurants and hotels where, we sit at the end of the airline, they sit at the end of the trip, they're been going up by ridiculous amounts of money.
Yes, huge amounts. So
what do you think about the politics of this?
I think the decision to go against Qatar Airline having I think it was extra 29 flights a week, 28 flights into Brisbane,
from 28
Sydney,
different destinations.
Yes, Sydney, Brisbane, Melbourne to different parts around the world. If you think about 28 flights, how many people on a plane? 300? That's about 8,000 people per week coming and going, and 8,000 tickets that say, I just want to go on a holiday, I'll search around. Without those 8,000 tickets, there's fewer tickets for me to choose from. So therefore the price that even Qatar, let alone Qantas or anyone else charges, stays high. You only have to look at the European airline industry where there's a whole lot of small people. Obviously the distance they travel is much smaller because they're all geographically closer to each other. But you can get really cheap airfares from London to Frankfurt to Milan to Athens to wherever because there's so much competition. That is actually working against the deceleration in inflation. You're right, the services inflation's a real problem.
Because services includes airfares.
Airfares, correct. It's funny, Mark, I had a little look at this because as I was heading up to Sydney the day before yesterday, I was listening to a podcast, someone was talking about the airfare issue. So I'm
really?
International travel makes up 1.9% of the basket of the consumer price index. We talk about the basket of goods and services.
Of the total basket?
Of the total, but 1.9%.
Okay, let's call it 2.
Call it 2 because maths is, I agree with you because I haven't had enough coffee today yet. But so if prices were to drop 5% because of competition, and remember they were very elevated, and international air tickets are still really expensive compared with where they were pre-pandemic. They are. So just say this competition, not just Qatar Airlines, but we let in, I don't know, Singapore Airlines and Qantas increased their capacity.
I'm not here belting for Qatar, by the way.
No, I'm just Emirates Air, whatever.
More competition.
Delta, I don't know, Cathay Pacific, I don't know. Not that you want open slather, but we need more competition. If the international airfares dropped by, let's just say 5%, something's got a 2% weighting in the CPI basket, okay, you clip 0.1 off your inflation rate. So if your forecast was going to be 3, now going to be 2.9. Wow. Or put it this way, if prices go up, instead of 3, it comes 3.1. And okay, that's just one component of your inflation basket.
But you can control it.
Well, you can control the number of people who come, number of flights that come and go into Australia. And whether it's Adelaide or Perth or Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, obviously they're big centres for the international flights. The competition policy in Australia is really good. Competition works really well in our banking system. It's pretty, from speaking to someone who knows, it's cutthroat.
Yeah.
And people's loyalty, there is an element of loyalty and that's great. But however, if company XYZ offers you a discount,
you'll take
and
it.
You say, oh, look, I like Qantas, and but if I can fly to Athens for $200 cheaper, and the airline's much for muchness, I'm going to save $200. Yeah. Of course we are.
So what do you think as a matter of policy? Do you think
I think it was a wrong decision.
Do you think the PM should weigh into this though? Do you mean where does the PM get involved? Does the PM get in and say, listen, I don't really want to. I recognise the issue, but my reasoning for this is to help all Australians when it comes to interest rates. And one of the ways I can do that is get inflation down. And one of the ways I can get inflation down is attack the services part of the industry and open slather.
I reckon you can have a very good argument from the Minister for Transport.
Yeah, but,
and
he,
the
but he
Treasury.
loaded the Transport Minister up. I heard him say, well,
Yeah.
that's not my decision. That's for the Minister for Transport.
Well, it's actually the government's decision, by the way. So
Yeah.
that might have been just a bit of a handball
Yeah, that's
around
what
the
I
corner.
thought.
But the government does control the flow of international airlines, who comes, which cities they go to, and and again, it's one of those things where you don't say all of a sudden we're going to have 500 new flights a month. No, do an extra 10, do an extra 20. See how it goes. And okay, if you have a flood and it causes genuine problems, yeah, you can have too much of a good thing. You can have an oversupply. But if it keeps prices competitive, if it keeps the price of tickets flat to lower, it's lower inflation. It's productivity too. And it's not just holiday makers going off to sun themselves on a Greek island. Business people travel.
It's also people coming
It's a
here
business
as well.
cost. And yes, the plane, we fly out, but holiday makers come here. They stay at our nice hotels, eat our lovely
food.
food.
It's good for GDP.
Drink our lovely wine. They go on tours of the harbour. They go down to Melbourne for the art galleries, go up to the Hunter Valley. Queensland, tourism is terrific. Again, pre-pandemic, it was our third or fourth biggest export earner. Tourists coming to Australia, spending their money here, is like, thank you for looking at our things, and while you're here, leave a couple of $1,000 for the hotel and the food.
So again, Steve,
and the car hire, yeah.
Government policy, or whatever the government policy is impacting inflation, and therefore impacting interest rates. And at the end of the day, the poor buggers who are paying for this are the people who can least afford it. And in fact, they're the ones who never go away on holidays, and they're never going off, jetting off to wherever. They're sitting there just slogging away. And I just think, for me anyway, I just wish there was somebody who would sit over the top of this. But anyway, more importantly, you and me, let's look at your chart, mate.
My iconic monetary policy checklist. And here it is again for everybody to see. And let's go through it, Mark.
Go for it.
And you'll see, I'll give you the answer before we start, why interest rates are on hold and why financial markets are pricing in just the possibility that the next move in rates is down. Not yet, not for a year or so, but just in the middle to latter part of 2024, it might be down. Here we go. GDP, it's really weakening. There's no question that it's slowing down. It's neutral. It's not bad yet. In the next couple of quarters, it could well move to the easing camp.
And they like to see it, governments or RBA likes to see GDP between 3 and 3.5.
Correct.
Yeah.
Possibly a little less with our ageing population. But but at the moment, we're heading for GDP of 1.5. We haven't got there yet, but we'll do that next month when we get the updated numbers. Inflation, I'm going to put tightening to neutral. It's coming down sharply around the world. Commodity prices are down, and while petrol prices have shot up a bit, there's more to the inflation story than just petrol. If that was the only thing in the whole checklist that we'd be looking at, you'd say there's a bias to hike, but as we'll see, there's more than that. Labour market, I'm moving to right all the way to neutral. That fall in employment that we saw in July, the uptick in the unemployment rate, the fall in job vacancies, the fall in job advertisements, it suggested to me that the labour market's still okay. It's not in the easing side yet, but it's starting to slow down.
Especially given when the RBA governor-elect has said, we want 4.5%.
Yep, and we're on our way to get it, by the way.
Trending that direction.
Yep, and if it gets there in the next 6 months, she'll be happy, we'll be happy, she'll have hit the inflation target more easily.
Well, who won't be happy is 140,000 people losing jobs.
That's the issue, yes. Yeah, indeed. Wages, as we spent a bit of time discussing, 3.6% annual growth in wages, no problem. Not a problem in the world.
Right,
perfect.
right territory.
It's sort of like not too hot, not too cold,
It's
just
Goldilocks.
right. Goldilocks wages growth. Yeah. International economy, I'm going to put almost in easing. China is very weak, our major export market, but the US has been surprisingly resilient in the last month or so. A lot of the data that we've seen on their labour market, on their bottom line GDP numbers have been a bit stronger. Same in Europe. Europe's slowing down, but it's not catastrophic. So it's sort of towards easing. And the markets in Europe, US, Canada, UK, or UK's got more rate hikes. They're slightly different. But they're sort of a little bit like us. Probably not another rate hike, but they're not quite ready to price in rate cuts. So they're putting that towards that end of the side. House prices, they're going up after falling. I'm putting that just in the neutral camp. They're neither up nor down. They went down 9%. They're up about 5 or 6%. There's a bit of pressure. There's pressure on rents, as you discussed.
But let's qualify that, though. we're not in a normal market. So the
Correct.
normal supply demand is, in other words, demand is not going up, just that the supply is going down.
Correct. We've got poor levels of supply.
And I would like to just quickly explain that
Oh,
because, in terms of assessing demand, the thing that creates demand is affordability, and
yep.
affordability is out of control because we now assess people's borrowing capacity at nearly 10%.
Yep.
So as a
Yeah.
result of that, we can lend less or we don't lend at all. And therefore the demand curve or the demand, the demand curve is nowhere near where it was a year ago.
Correct.
But the supply curve has also sort of dropped. So where the two meet on the x-axis should show a lower price, but it's not yet.
And there's just a hint again. Remember the spring selling season is usually when there is a bit of seasonality in house prices, no doubt. So we've got the big selling season. There's new listings. The data from CoreLogic and SQM research showed new listings have gone up unusually strongly.
Yeah.
And a bit of discussion about investors getting out, that investors are having to, even though they get negative gearing benefits, they still have to pay the interest costs and all this stuff. So there's evidence that there's a bit more supply coming onto the market. So house prices have got to be neutral.
And I think that's right.
It's not, they're not, you wouldn't hike rates, you wouldn't, about neutral. Retail sales, shocking. We consumers, and I'll put consumer sentiment in that. We saw all the Westpac consumer sentiment. We saw the retail sales numbers come out from the Bureau of Stats. Retail spending now is lower than it was in October last year. So people are hunkering down. We consumers aren't silly. Cost of living pressures, interest rate pressures, and now just the hints of a weakness in the labour market. What are you going to do? You're going to go out and have that fancy restaurant meal. You're going to buy, that fancy sort of holiday away. Well, look, let's just hunker down, stay at home. So retail sales are really weak and sentiment's pretty bad. Building approvals. Well, that's the supply of dwellings.
Down.
Too low. Interest rates are a factor in property developers' decision to whether I'm going to build that series of townhouses or I'm not. Well, if interest rates are up here and my cost of borrowing money to build these townhouses is so high, I'm not going to build them. So and they're really weak. Business investment, it's doing okay. There's a catch up from the COVID when a lot of businesses shelved machinery and equipment purchases and building warehouses. That's actually doing okay. The Bureau of Stats data on business investments, pretty good. Same with business confidence. It's come down a bit as the economy slowed down, but unlike consumers who are feeling pretty miserable, the business sector is, I'll call it okay, and that's why it's neutral. It's not strong, not weak. Another one of those ones that's in the middle. Commodity prices, well, they were falling. We noticed you fill up your car with petrol, $2 a litre now, thereabouts. Did get down to about $1.70 a couple of months ago. So commodity prices were down. They've gone up a bit. China's slowing down, the iron ore price, things that matter to Australia, they're sort of all over the place. So I'll put that in neutral. Stock market. I'm going to put that cheekily in neutral to tightening because it's actually really resilient. The US, the NASDAQ, with all these tech stocks, all these crazy, chip makers and things doing really well. And not say the hike rates because the stock market's strong, but it says to me that if there was a hike, and okay, the market would probably drop a bit, but it's dropping from a level up here, not down here. And finally, current rates, I'm going to put that in the neutral to easing side. Our 4.1% cash rate, 400 points of rate hikes in the last 15, 16 months or so. Policy's tight. The RBA acknowledged that policy is restrictive. To get super restrictive, you'd need some of these discs to come back to the tightening side of our checklist.
So you're going to say nothing, no change.
Most of them are here, slight skewing to easing, but for the rate cut decision to be realistic, and it's not. I just want to emphasise this. We are not about to get a rate cut. If we were to get a rate cut in 9 to 12 months, this inflation marker has to go back to neutral or even easing, and that means inflation, not just for 1 quarter, 1 month at 3%. It's got to be 2.5 or less. We're not there yet, and we may not be there for a year. But the critical thing about the rate cycle or a cutting cycle is inflation. A hiking cycle is postponed when you get the bulk of these other ones neutral to easing.
Right. So but I think what you're also saying is that in the neutral column, you want to see more of these discs in order to, because everyone's now thinking not so much when the rate's going to rise, are the rates going to rise, which is where we were a year ago.
Yes.
We're now thinking, are rates going to ease? because
And that's a bit of a discussion. And Bill Ems is our mate Bill Ems is on the record saying that I think his latest forecast was he's sort of moving away from Westpac was late 24 and in 25. I think he had 7 rate cuts.
Yeah, 7 rate cuts.
If I remember correctly, don't quote me on Bill.
No,
Apologies.
no, it was 7. It was 7.
Yeah, so back down to what's that? About 2.25% cash rate from 4.1.
I think that's a bit aggressive, but
it's a bit aggressive. But hey, as we were just discussing, Bill's a pretty sharp thinker on all these sort of things. And if it's 5 or 6 or 7, it's still a great call if it comes to fruition. But there are other people sort of saying, well, look, yeah, they've done enough. There's enough rate hikes in the system. These weakening indicators around retail sales, it's the consumer where the weakness in the economy is. Business sector's doing okay. Stock market's doing okay. It's us consumers that are under the pump, cost of living, interest rates. I know I've said that 3 times already in our recording. That is the name of the game.
So, and just to close it out. So, you made a very good point. The RBA's directs its traffic towards consumers. It also directs its traffic towards small business owners. I'll just park that one and come back to it. But they direct their traffic towards consumers. And as a result of consumers slowing down in their spending, because their cost of living is much higher, because their interest rates are much higher now, or in the case of renters, the rent's much higher, GDP starts to suffer because, household consumption is 60 to 70% of the total GDP number. So the indicators that, listeners should be looking for is where's GDP going? Is GDP starting to move, down from, 2% to 1.5% down to some other number? If we start seeing that, we're in good shape relative to expecting interest rate reductions. And the other thing is in terms of business confidence, and it's a very important point you made in business investment. Businesses are the biggest employer in the country. 70% of all employees are employed by small business, not big business, small business. Yeah. And it's not until consumers' behavior affects small business owners that small business owners start to say, I can't give you a wage rise, or worse still, I'm going to have to put someone off, or worse still, I'm not going to replace someone. Then and only then can we start to expect the RBA to be looking at easing, because as much as everybody keeps banging on it, but governments keep banging on about how important the business community is, to Australia's, we're the engine room of all of Australia. And when I say business consumers, small business owners, I'm talking about people who work for themselves, like you, me, everybody else. Yep. If we start tightening our belts and we start to lose a bit of the confidence away from neutral to easing, then that will affect employment, our unemployment. And the unemployment number will start to rise. And given that we've had a lot of people come into this country who are going to be looking for a job, that can help us with the labour market numbers as well in terms of, I'm talking about wages. So my gut feeling is, because everyone always asks me when I bump them, I'm sure they're doing the same to you, but when will we start to see rate reductions and how much by? Well, how much by, I don't know, somewhere between, for me, I reckon the proper neutral position for the RBA cash rate is somewhere between 3 and 3.5%. That's what I reckon. It's just a view, but that means we're sort of looking at maybe 3 rate reductions. When it will be if we keep seeing that unemployment number creeping up towards 4.5. Yep. And that's going to come off the back of someone saying, instead of having 2 coffees every morning, I'm going to have 1. I'm going to make 1 at home. And that's the deal.
Coffee shop owner who has 3 people making the coffee, washing the dishes.
Change the shifts around to save money.
Drops fewer hours. Yeah. Fewer hours or lesser people.
Less people.
That small business point that you made was absolutely spot on. When people are coming in your door, they're spending money, fantastic. Everybody's happy. Employment is one thing, but it's also, I'm going to get that new machine. I need a new car, a new thing. That's economic activity. I need a new van to deliver my goods. I'm a tradie. I need a new power drill and all this other stuff. So I'm building lots of houses. Well, hopefully. And until that happens, we've got this downside risk to the economy. If they postpone their decisions to buy a new car, to buy new machinery, cut the hours of people working in their little businesses, then the economy, that negative spiral of economic weakness comes through.
And I mean, I know people listen to the show because they want to hear someone like you who's an expert in economics, et cetera, and is always following the data and, working things out and, future forecasting and all that sort of stuff. But what I would say to people is, yeah, Steve can put it into numbers and he can put it into formulas and algorithms and all that sort of stuff. But at the end of the day, all the things you've gone through in your checklist, you, the consumer can actually go out and say, you know what? There's not many people in this restaurant anymore. There's not many people at Bunnings anymore. I'm just noticing different. And ask the owners, the businesses, how are you going?
Yeah.
And you'll get a sense of where this all ends up. And if you're watching this and you can see this chart, at the top of the chart is GDP and inflation. GDP and inflation. All the other things below it feed into GDP and inflation.
Correct.
GDP and inflation are just numbers at the end of the day, created by all the other things that sit below it: labor markets, wages, economic activity, international activity, house prices, retail sales. Consumer sentiment, we know. We live in the world. All of us normal people, outside of you, live in this world, and you get a sense of it. And you'll get just as good a sense of it as Steve will be able to articulate in numbers, and I might be able to articulate because I talk to probably more people than most people, but you, the consumer, you'll get a good sense of this, the way things are going.
What listeners are saying in their business, with their friends, their business associates, their kids, whatever, is tomorrow's economic data that they look at. What you're doing today is you're listening to this and thinking, oh, gee, the economy's a bit soggy. Oh, gee, I went out there and there's not many people around. Is the data that's going to be in retail sales next month, consumer sentiment and building approvals.
So just check yourselves. You've got a pretty good idea, but keep listening because we've got something else coming next month. Thanks, Cookie.
Thanks, Mark. Fantastic.